What if my husband's company didn't survive the 2008 crash because of him? What if it survived because of me, and he spent the next 15 years making sure I never found out that he knew? I've been sitting with that question for a long time now. Longer than I should have. My name is Edna Crossley, and I'm 63 years old. And I'm telling you this from the sunroom of a house I bought with my own money, in a neighborhood my husband once told me I'd never be able to afford without him. He wasn't cruel about it. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. Gerald Whitmore, excuse me, my ex-husband's Roger Ashby. No, I need to get this right from the start, because getting it right is the whole point of telling it. My husband's name is Leonard Ashby. We were married for 31 years. He was a civil engineer who built his own consulting firm in Oakville, Ontario, starting with nothing but a second-hand drafting table, and more confidence than the situation probably warranted. I admired that about him, once. I admired it so much that I folded my own ambitions neatly and set them on a shelf, the way you might store a winter coat at the end of the season, thinking you'll take it back down when the time is right. The time was never right. That's what Leonard kept telling me. We met in our late 20s at a continuing education class. I was taking an accounting course because I'd always had a head for numbers, and he was there because his business was growing faster than his bookkeeping could keep up with. I ended up helping him organize his invoicing before we'd even gone on a proper date. I should have charged him. Looking back, I really should have charged him. Instead, I married him and spent the next 3 decades being the quiet engine behind everything he built. I want to be precise about what that means, because it's easy to say I supported him and have people picture a woman who baked casseroles and kept the house tidy. I did those things too, but that's not what I mean. I mean, I managed his company's accounts for the first 8 years, unpaid, while our 2 children were young. I mean, I negotiated with suppliers when Leonard was too proud to admit cash flow was tight. I mean, I sat across from a bank manager in the fall of 2008 with our mortgage and Leonard's business line of credit both on the table, and I reworked the numbers in my head fast enough that the manager leaned back and said, "Your wife has a good grasp of this, Leonard." And Leonard nodded and said nothing. And on the drive home, he told me I'd embarrassed him by speaking too much. That was the moment I should have known. But I didn't. Or maybe I did know, somewhere deep and quiet, and I chose not to look at it directly. Our daughter, Fiona, would tell you I was always the smartest person in any room Leonard occupied. She'd say it with love, not cruelty. Fiona has always been honest in the way that people raised around silence learn to be honest in quick, precise sentences, because they learned early that long explanations don't get heard. Our son, Marcus, no, I promise myself no names from the list. Our son's name is Brendan Ashby, and Brendan was different. Brendan learned to read his father's moods the way you learn to read weather, because in our house, Leonard's moods were weather. You dressed accordingly. I don't blame Brendan for the years he spent reflecting his father's opinions back at him. I understood it. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. When I was 58 years old, my mother passed away and left me a small inheritance. Not a fortune. She'd lived modestly her whole life, but enough. $60,000, Canadian. Enough to do something with. If you were careful and you'd spent 30 years watching how money moved. I told Leonard I wanted to use some of it to start a small bookkeeping and financial consulting business. I'd been helping friends and neighbors with their taxes for years, informally, at kitchen tables with cups of tea going cold beside us. People trusted me. They came back. A woman down the street had once said to me, "Edna, you explain things the way my accountant never does. Like it actually matters that I understand." That stayed with me. Leonard listened to me describe my idea. He let me finish. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating. And he said, "You'd need clients. You don't have a network." "I do, actually," I said. "I've been building one for 20 years. He looked at me the way you might look at someone who's just said something sweetly naive. "Informal referrals from neighbors aren't a network, Edna. That's gossip with tax forms." Fiona, who was visiting that weekend, went still across the table. Brendan looked down at his plate. Leonard wasn't finished. "You're 60. The learning curve on building a real client base at this stage." He shook his head. "I just don't want to see you lose your mother's money. That's all," I said. "I appreciate your concern, and I didn't say anything else that evening, but something settled in me that night, the way sediment settles in still water. quietly, permanently, changing the composition of everything beneath the surface. I opened Crossley Financial Solutions 4 months later. I used $15,000 of my inheritance for startup costs, registration, a simple website, professional liability insurance, a decent laptop, and a small shared office space in Burlington that I rented by the day to start with. The remaining $45,000 I kept in a separate account that Leonard didn't know about. This wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was protection. I'd watched enough of my neighbors' marriages end to know that financial independence isn't distrust, it's wisdom. My first client was a woman named Petra Van Hook, who ran a small catering company out of her home and had been filing her taxes incorrectly for 3 years, in a way that was going to catch up with her badly. I spent 2 evenings with her at her kitchen table, untangling 4 years of records. When we were done, she said, "What do I owe you?" And I told her my rate, and she didn't flinch. She paid me the same week. She sent me 2 referrals before the month was out. Leonard didn't ask about the business. Not once in those early months. He'd occasionally make a comment at dinner. "How's the hobby going?" Or once, in front of Brendan and Brendan's wife, Claudine, "Your mother's been playing accountant." Claudine laughed, lightly, quickly, the way you laugh when you're trying to manage the temperature in a room. Fiona didn't laugh. Fiona looked at me across the table, and I looked back at her, and we had an entire conversation without saying a word. I kept my head down and worked. By the end of my first year, I had 11 regular clients. By the end of my second, I had 26, and I'd hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Greta who was sharp as anything and grateful for flexible hours because she had a toddler at home. I was bringing in more each month than I'd expected. Not Leonard's income, but real income. Consistent, growing income from work I understood completely and had done without recognition for decades. I had not told Leonard the actual numbers. This was deliberate. About 18 months into running Crossley Financial, I discovered something that changed the ground beneath my feet entirely. I should explain that during our marriage, Leonard and I had a joint account for household expenses and separate accounts for our personal use. I'd always managed the household account. What I hadn't known, what I discovered entirely by accident, because I was using our home computer and a browser window had been left open, was that Leonard had been transferring small amounts from the household account into an account I had no knowledge of. Not dramatic amounts. $200 here, $300 there. Small enough that I might not have noticed for years if I hadn't happened to look at the right screen at the wrong moment. I didn't say anything immediately. I'm not proud of the reason. It was partly shock, partly the old trained reflex of not wanting to make things uncomfortable. But mostly I needed to understand the full picture before I said a word, because I'd spent enough years being talked out of my own perceptions to know that I needed facts, not just feeling. I spent 2 weeks quietly gathering information. I found a pattern going back at least 4 years. Over 43 months, the total came to just over $19,000, redirected from our joint account into an account I had no access to. I documented everything. I photographed screens. I requested bank statements under the pretense of household budgeting. I built a complete picture with the same methodical care I'd give to any client's disorganized records. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Janet Cormier, and she came recommended by Petra Van Hook, who had used her during her own divorce and said, "Janet doesn't fuss. She just gets things done." Janet reviewed what I'd brought her and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You've documented this very well. I've been doing this kind of work for 30 years, I said. I did not go home and confront Leonard that evening. I called Fiona instead. She drove down from Guelph the same night and sat across from me at my kitchen table, in the kitchen of the house that was in both our names, and she listened to everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, do you still want this marriage?" I thought about it, genuinely, which is perhaps the saddest part. I turned the question over slowly, the way you turn over something you've carried for a long time and are only now looking at clearly, in good light. And I said, "I don't think there's a marriage left to want." She nodded. She didn't cry. Neither did I, not then. We had tea and she stayed the night, and in the morning she helped me go through the filing cabinet where Leonard kept his own paperwork, which I had a legal right to access. I called Janet Cormier first thing the following Monday. What happened with Leonard? I will tell you plainly, because I think plainness is what it deserves. He was shocked, not by the financial situation, or not only by that, but by the fact that I had documented it, that I had retained counsel before speaking to him, that I had approached the whole thing with the same quiet competence he'd spent 30 years dismissing as a hobby. He tried several things in sequence. He said there was an explanation. He said I was misreading the situation. He said I was doing this to punish him for the comment about the business. He said I didn't understand how much he'd carried, financially, over the years. I let him say all of it. Then I placed a copy of Janet Cormier's initial letter on the kitchen table and I said, I understand it very well, Leonard. You taught me to. We separated in November. The divorce was finalized the following September. I kept the house. Because the equity was largely built on the income I had managed and the savings I had overseen, and because Leonard's lawyer, once he had a proper look at the documentation Janet and I had assembled, advised Leonard not to contest it. Brendan took his father's side, initially. I'd expected that. It hurt the way I knew it would hurt. Bone deep, old ache hurt, not sharp but persistent. Brendan called me in the first month after Leonard moved out. The first call was hard. He said things that Leonard had said to him, that I was being vindictive, that the finances were complicated, that I didn't have the full picture. I listened and then I said, Brendan, I assembled the full picture myself. I have it in a binder if you'd like to see it. He didn't have an answer for that. The second call about 3 weeks later was different. He was quieter. He said, Mum, I think I've been repeating things without thinking about whether they're true. He sounded tired and young and sorry. I said, I know, that's okay. We can talk. We did talk. It took months to fully find our footing again, but we found it. Fiona, throughout all of this, was a fixed point. She didn't make speeches. She just showed up, consistently, with practical help and clear eyes. In the spring, 8 months after Leonard moved into an apartment in Mississauga, I got a phone call from a woman named Deborah Stein, who ran a small construction company in Hamilton. She'd been referred by a client of mine, and she needed help restructuring her business accounting systems after a period of rapid growth. We met for coffee in Hamilton, and I liked her immediately. She was direct and funny, and had no patience for being condescended to, which I recognized as a quality earned through experience. By the end of that meeting, she'd offered me a retainer, a proper one, with a monthly fee. That was, not to be coy about it, more than I had ever brought home from any single client in my first 2 years of business. I drove home along the lakeshore, and I cried a little, not sadly, but the way you cry when something fits exactly the shape of a space that has been empty a long time. Crossley Financial had, by that point, 28 active clients. I'd moved from the shared office space into my own small office in Burlington. A real one, with my name on the door and a fern in the corner that Greta had insisted on. We had a wait list. I had turned down 3 clients in the past 4 months because I wanted to be careful about growth. I'd watched enough businesses collapse under the weight of expanding too fast, and I was not going to be one of them. What I didn't know that spring was that Leonard's firm was in trouble. I found out the way you find out most things when you've lived in a community for 30 years. Through the ordinary web of who knows whom. A woman at my yoga class mentioned it in passing. Her husband worked for a municipal contractor who used Leonard's firm for inspection sign-offs. And there had been delays, missed deadlines, rumors of staffing problems. I filed the information away and said nothing. A few weeks later, Deborah Stein called me about something unrelated to our retainer arrangement. She was considering acquiring a smaller competitor and wanted my read on the financials. In the course of that conversation, she mentioned that she'd recently been approached by Ashby Engineering about a subcontracting arrangement, and that she'd looked into them and found the books concerning enough to decline. Nothing that jumps out as fraud, she said. Just a company that doesn't know where its money is going. I knew then that whatever had been holding Leonard's firm together was no longer holding. That summer, Leonard called me for the first time since the divorce had been finalized. It was a Saturday morning. I was in my sunroom with coffee and the Globe and Mail, and when I saw his name on my phone, I sat with it for a moment before I answered. He asked how I was. I said I was well. There was a pause, the kind that has weight in it. Then he said, "I've been hearing things about your business, that it's doing well." "It is," I said. Another pause. I wanted to say, "I think I underestimated you when you started it." I let the silence sit for a moment. Outside, a pair of cedar waxwings were investigating the crabapple tree in my garden. I watched them. "You did," I said. "You underestimated me for a long time," he said. "I know." And then, awkwardly, inadequately, "I'm sorry, Edna. I didn't say it was fine because it wasn't fine. I didn't say I forgave him because forgiveness is something I'm still working on, privately, at my own pace, and I don't owe anyone a timeline on it." I said, "Thank you for saying so." And I meant it, exactly that much and no more. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down and picked up my coffee. A week later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Ashby Engineering had lost 2 of its 3 major municipal contracts and was in the process of downsizing significantly. I heard it the same way I heard most things that year. Through the quiet, reliable network that Leonard had once called gossip with tax forms. My network. I want to be honest about what I felt when I heard that, because I think honesty matters more than the tidy version of the story. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and more complicated. A kind of vindication that was mixed up with grief, because the company had been part of my life too. I'd helped save it in 2008. I knew its rhythms and its weak points and its history, the way you know a house you've lived in for decades, even after you've moved out. Some part of me would always have a stake in it. But I also felt, underneath all of that, something that I can only describe as a loosening. Like a knot I hadn't fully known was there had finally let go. This past February, I was invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship event in Burlington. The woman who organized it had been connected to me through Deborah Stein, and she called me and said they were looking for someone who'd started a business later in life. And would I be willing to share my story? I said yes before I'd fully thought it through. Why? The night of the event, I sat in the front row before it started and looked at the room, maybe 60 women, ranging in age from their 30s to their late 60s, and a few younger ones who might have been students. I thought about what Leonard had said at that dinner table 5 years earlier. "You'd need clients. You don't have a network." When I got up to speak, I told the truth. I told them I started my business at 58 with $15,000 and a telephone full of contacts that people had spent years telling me weren't real. I told them about the part-time assistant and the shared office space and the fern that Greta had insisted on. I told them, briefly, about the marriage, not to cast Leonard as a villain, but because I think it matters to say plainly that the people who love us are sometimes the ones who most consistently underestimate us, and that this is one of the harder things to reckon with. I did not tell them about the $19,000. Some things are yours to carry, and not everyone's to know. At the end, a woman in her mid-50s came up to me and said, "I've been sitting on an idea for 3 years, because my husband thinks the timing isn't right." She had that particular kind of tiredness in her face, not physical tiredness, but the tiredness of having argued with yourself, soothed for a long time and still not won. I said, "The timing will never be right. That's not actually what you're waiting for." She nodded slowly, like she'd already known this and had needed to hear it from someone else. I thought about that on the drive home. About how many of us carry real capability with us for years and decades, folding it neatly, setting it on the shelf, waiting for the right season. And I thought about my mother, who left me $60,000 in a quiet faith that I would know what to do with it. I think she did know. I think she'd watched me for 60 years and had a very clear picture of what I was capable of. Crossley Financial turns 5 years old this autumn. We have 41 active clients. Greta is now full-time, with benefits, and we brought on a second part-time consultant last spring, a woman named Susan who was laid off from a corporate accounting firm at 54, and who brings with her 30 years of expertise that her previous employer had quietly decided to retire along with her. The fern in the corner has been repotted twice. Leonard's firm, I understand, is still operating at about a third of its previous size. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because I think there is something worth naming in the fact that the company survived the years when I was involved in it and struggled in the years after, and that this was never a coincidence, even if it took a very long time for anyone to say so out loud. Leonard said so that Saturday morning on the phone, in his imprecise, insufficient human way. I believe he meant it. I believe he looked back across 31 years and saw, more clearly than he'd allowed himself to before, what had actually been holding things together. I've been asked, since I started telling this story publicly, whether I'm angry. People expect anger, I think. They want the version where I am furious in a photogenic way, where the injustice of it has a clean, expressible shape. Mostly what I feel is clear. Clearer than I've felt in years. Like the windows in this sunroom on a cold morning when the frost on the glass has finally let go. Everything on the other side coming into focus, precise and bright and mine. My mother used to say that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. She was quoting someone. I'm sure, but she said it often enough that it became hers. I think about it a lot. I think about the $15,000 and the laptop and the shared office space by the day. I think about Petra Van Hook's kitchen table and the invoice I sent and the referrals that followed. I should have started sooner, but I started. And it turns out that starting, even late, even quietly, even with people at your dinner table laughing, starting is enough to change everything.